Hi, I'm Kate Owens. I am an iOS engineer on the mobile team at Deque Systems, and you are at Swiftui and accessibility goodies and gotchas. Thanks for coming. I'm very excited to talk to you all about this stuff today. So today we're going to be covering a few things. We're going to start with a brief overview of Swiftui, just a refresher. We're going to talk a bit about Swiftui and accessibility. And then we are going to go into our goodies and gotchas, the star of the show. Okay, so let's start with Swiftui, brief overview. So what's the story with Swiftui? It's the new user interface framework by Apple. It was announced in 2019 at WWDC. So it's still relatively newer. It's a declarative syntax. So what that means is you just kind of declare what element you want, where you want it to go, what you want it to look like, declare what you want, and it will do it, at least mostly. And Swiftui, one of my most favorite things about it is that there are no more annoying NS layout constraints to deal with. You don't have to deal with any of that now. So that's wonderful, beautiful thing. And Swiftui will let you create really beautiful views that look great with a lot less code than if you were using UIKit. The code for Swiftui is very handsome, very readable, easy to consume. So I've put a screenshot at the very bottom of how to create a text element, kind of like a label when you're using Swiftui. So you see here, we've got a struct. And within that, we have a body that is it's a variable, calculated variable that is a closure, and you just declare whatever it is you want on your view within that closure. So in our curly braces, we say text, parens, and then we put a string in there. In this case, it is hello world. So it is as simple as that. It is quite a different game than creating a label text element with UIKit. So I think this is a really powerful example of just how much less code and how, just different Swiftui is compared. Swiftui and accessibility. So Swiftui is much different than UIKit in terms of the accessibility. One of the biggest differences is that by default with Swiftui, most elements are already voiceover and other assistive technology focusable. Other assistive technologies being switch control, voice control, just to name a few. So by default, most of those things will already be able to be consumed with an assistive technology for someone who's using that. So that's very exciting. Most elements also already have an accessibility label by default. Swiftui will most of the time generate an accessibility label from the text that's in an element. So it's one less thing that you might have to do or think about. It is worth noting, though, that although most of the elements, default elements are accessible by default, not all the custom controls are focusable and or labeled by default. So we've got a little bit of divergence there. It's important to keep in mind as we go through. Swiftui does offer a somewhat decent accessibility experience out of the box. So not a ton of heavy lifting and you get decent accessibility. But the important thing here, and I can't emphasize this enough, is that decent is not great. We do not want to just have a decent, okay, so accessibility experience. We want it to be great. We want it to be a lot better. Goodies and gotchas. Very excited to talk about these. So these are things that I learned from creating an accessible Swiftui iOS app. We'll start with a quick note. We're going to see some screen recordings from an app today that I created called Plantiverse. I just, simple app to keep track of plants. And the whole idea with it was really just having a good, exciting way to get familiar with SwiftUI accessibility, see what it's like to actually get in there and get my toes wet and my hands dirty. You will be seeing Plantiverse today. It is a public repo. You can feel free to clone it if you want, play around with the accessibility, you know, do whatever you like with it. It's a fun way to get a firsthand taste of what it's like to work with SwiftUI and the accessibility. Goodies and gotchas. Okay, so we've been talking about goodies, we've been talking about gotchas, but what are they? So goodie is something that makes it a lot easier for a developer to make accessibility changes that can improve the accessibility experience. Something that kind of makes you say, oh, goodie, that's going to be great to use in terms of accessibility. Whereas a gotcha is something that makes it a lot easier for a developer to make an accessibility mistake, quite possibly without even realizing it. Gotchas are very sneaky. You got to watch out for them. And it is worth noting that a goodie can also become a gotcha very easily if it's not used correctly or used in the right context. We'll go over that a little bit more later though. Okay, with that in mind, let's get started with the good things first. We'll start with our goodies. So the first goodie is one that we mentioned briefly, default basic accessibility. So one thing that's very cool about this is that with SwiftUI, the accessibility notifications are handled automatically. So that means that you don't need to do any of the posting or listening for notifications if an accessibility setting on the device is changed. It's all done for you. So it's a big goodie. Most of the elements are automatically marked as accessibility elements. You don't have to go through every single element that you want and explicitly mark it as true for accessibility element like you'd have to in UIKit. So that's a big time saver, a lot less, little heavy lifting. Touched on this a little bit earlier, but default controls and elements such as a button, toggle, or switch, as some people call it, text field, image, just to name a few, those are automatically going to be focusable with an assistive technology. It will be announced or have a focus box, depends on which technology it is, but those default controls are going to be focusable with assistive technologies automatically, which is very good. If it's applicable, they will be assigned an action. Obviously, if you've got an image, that's a case where there's not going to, an action isn't applicable. So that's one where that wouldn't be the case. But if you're making a custom text field or a button, SwiftUI will handle creating the action for you. And I mentioned this earlier too, the default accessibility label. These elements already are assigned a default accessibility label by SwiftUI. So custom controls, that's something where there's a little bit of difference in terms of the basic accessibility. They are given accessibility labels from the text automatically, but they won't necessarily have an action assigned to them for the controls. You'll see an example of that goes into more depth a little bit later. So you're going to be seeing some screen recordings here because I think that it is very important for everyone to kind of not just hear about what an accessibility experience is like when it's good or bad, but I would want people to actually experience it firsthand. So we're going to go through this screen. It is the main screen on the Plantiverse app that I talked about. And we are going to see what the default accessibility that Swift has given it, what that is like to experience. So let's take a peek.
Plantiverse. My Plantiverse. Line, 3 horizontal, decrease, button, heading, living room. Add, button. Aloe vera, good. Succulent, button. Monstera delicosa, repot. Great. Houseplant, button. Plantiverse, Monstera delicosa, image, antiverse, ng room.
Okay, so the good thing is that, all of those main elements on the screen were able to be focused with voiceover. We could hear them. There were focus boxes around everything. We had the controls on the main screen had actions that we could use. But then, on the other hand, we do still have some strange, unexpected announcements for images. And we also have some, a little bit overload of information for those plant tiles, but we'll go into that later. But as you can see, as I said earlier, it is default basic accessibility, very, low level. It's decent. It's not great. So now we've all seen that in person. Let's take a look at goodie number 2. This one is pretty cool. This is one of my favorite things that was announced recently at WWDC, and it is the Accessibility Representation API or view modifier. So what this will do is it's going to replace the accessibility elements of a view with the accessibility elements of another type of view. What that means is if we've got something like a custom toggle that we've created, and we want to use this accessibility representation on it, it would then replace our custom toggles accessibility elements with that of a standard toggles accessibility elements. So it's a very neat API. It uses non-interactive hidden view that you specify in a closure, and that is what is responsible for generating the accessibility elements. So you specify what kind of view you want in your closure, and accessibility representation will create a non-interactive hidden view of what you have specified. And accessibility representation makes it just so much simpler, a lot less time consuming to create custom controls that are fully accessible. So let's go back to our toggle example, a custom toggle. By default, that wouldn't be very accessible. And in order to give it the accessibility of a standard toggle, all we've got to do, as you can see in our screenshot, is we just say dot accessibility representation, and then we've got some curly braces where we are going to specify a toggle with a is on parameter, and we pass in a Boolean state variable with that, a binding. And then inside curly braces again, we've got text, plant is repotted. So that text is what is going to be the new accessibility label. So it just uses that toggle and swaps it out in terms of the accessibility elements. It's very cool. So we don't have to spend a bunch of time, adding, removing different accessibility traits. There's not the risk of, oh, I forgot to add this trait, I forgot to take this one out, because this will handle it for you. So this is a major goodie, almost a greatie, if you could call it that. So let's take a look at another screen in our Plantiverse app to experience this in action. We've got an add plant screen, and it has 3 different custom controls on here that I made. We've got a custom toggle. We've got a custom slider. We've also got a custom stepper at the bottom. We're just going to be focusing on the toggle and slider for this example. So if we don't have an accessibility representation API for the toggle, it's going to be announced as plant is repotted, circle, image. Not great. Circle image, that doesn't really mean anything. You wouldn't really even know what you're supposed to do with this. So that is you're going to see the magic of accessibility representation in a second. And then, if we look at our window distance slider, a custom slider, without accessibility representation, the default announcement would be window distance in window. And then VoiceOver would just skip right on over the slider at the bottom, the control. So now that we've gone over that, let's take a peek at what the experience becomes when we are actually using accessibility representation for these custom controls.
Plant is repotted. Switch button, off. Double tap to toggle setting. On. Window distance, in window, adjustable. Swipe up or down with one finger to adjust the value. 1 foot. 2 feet.
Okay, so, as you can see, it's just huge improvement already. We went from plant is repotted circle image, a control that you can't even tell it's a controller, that it does anything really by the default announcement. But then when we use the accessibility representation, we've got perfect announcement for that. And we've also got a great announcement for our adjustable control, the window distance slider. So it's a very cool and very powerful part of Swiftui that I really love. All right, our third goodie. This is one of my most favorites. It is the accessibility custom content. So accessibility custom content API is a way to provide information to users in smaller and more specific portions, specifically when they need it. So instead of just throwing out a bunch of stuff all the time, it's a little bit more focused, targeted. For an example, if we think back to the first screen that we went over in the Plantiverse app, we had those plant tiles that would announce the plant name. So it would say plant name, health, category, tasks due. But a user might not and probably doesn't want to know every single piece of that data every single time a plant tile is focused. That's a lot. It's very overwhelming. So, views with somewhat complex data sets like this, they can be really overwhelming to navigate using an assistive technology. And you're maybe providing a lot more information than a user needs and wants each time an element is focused. So this API is very good at handling that. So back to our main plant screen. For this plant tile, our Monstera plant tile, if we don't use custom content, then the default announcement would be something like Monstera delicosa, button, repot, great, houseplant. But it's probably safe it's safe to think that you maybe don't need to know about the condition of the plant every single time. You might not need to know what type of plant, what category it is every time. So we've used our custom content in this next recording to sort of trim it down a little bit and provide users with only the basic, most important things and give them the option to choose more. So let's take a look at that.
Monstera delicosa, repot due, button, more content available. Headings. Containers, headings, more content. Houseplant, plant category. Great, plant health. Repot due, tasks due.
Okay, so
voiceover off.
Oh, okay. So as you saw, now we have a much more manageable, bite-sized, relevant announcement for our plant tiles. We've got the name of the plant, the fact that it's a button, and a task that's due. So that's probably something that you'd want to know before even, you'd want to know that every time probably. So then, as you saw, we use our rotor and we can select more content. And then we can pick if we want to know about our plant's health. We can decide then, do we want to know what kind of a category of plant? So this is a great way to handle that. This is seriously one of my favorite things that was announced at WWDC. I love it very much, if you can't tell. Okay, so on to our fourth goodie. This one is kind of complicated. I've got a mixed feelings about it. It is the accessibility sort priority API. What this does is it will change the sort order for accessibility elements. So you can say, hey, focus this element before you focus this one. The reason I've got a lot of feelings and mixed feelings about this is because it's one that should really only be used when it makes sense for the user in terms of navigation and semantic views, views that should be grouped together or experienced in a certain way. A question to ask yourself when deciding whether or not to use accessibility sort priority: will the user have more context or a better experience if one element is focused before or after another? That's a huge thing to keep in mind when deciding to use this. So in this example, accessibility sort priority, we've got two recordings. So we've got exhibit A is a plant detail screen where we have an edit button, the top right corner of the screen in the nav bar and toolbar. And we don't have an accessibility sort priority set for it. So let's see what that is like.
Edit plant button. Aloe vera heading.
Sorry, we do have one set for that. So keep that experience in mind, how we were able to go to our plant detail screen and immediately we know that we have an option to edit the plant. And this works well because it's reasonable that if a user is going to a detail screen of their plant, they already know what the plant's name would be. They would have just heard it. And it's very likely that they would be going to edit details of it. So that's why this is a particularly good use case for this API. So now we've got our exhibit B of what it's like when you land on the screen and you do not have a sort priority set for the edit button.
Monstera delicosa, image, Lantiverse, ring room, decorative plant, moi. Add a new image, button. Plant details. Plant category, houseplant. Plant health, great. Distance from window, unspecified. Pot size, unspecified. Has this plant been repotted? No. Tasks to complete. Repot. Repot.
So you probably noticed about that example is that we don't even get a chance to, know that there's the edit button there at the top. There's no announcement for it. And even if it was announced at the end, that is a lot of swiping to have to go through to reach, that element. So this is a pretty powerful example of when accessibility sort priority can be used for good. Okay, and we are on goodie number 5, accessibility preview. This is another one. You're probably not, surprised to hear it, but I'm pretty excited about this one too. Accessibility preview will let you preview all of the accessibility properties of a view right from Xcode. You don't have to run the app to do it. So you can see things like the accessibility label, accessibility value, accessibility sort order. That's just to name a few. You can see many more things too. This can save you a lot of time. You don't have to run your app to figure out what the accessibility is like. If you just want to do a quick check-in, make sure you're on the right track. We've got here, for our goodie in action accessibility preview, I've put a screenshot of Xcode. And on the far left, we have the file for our plants grid, that first main screen that we saw on the Plantiverse app, where it's got all the little plant tiles. And then to the right of that, we've got our Xcode preview of the screen. To the right of that is where we see all of the magic. We have the accessibility preview opened on the far right panel of Xcode. And here we can see every accessibility element on the screen. We can see our labels, we can see the traits, whether or not that element is disabled. We can see our actions and our custom content. And the order in which these are listed is the order in which they'll be announced. So this, you can probably see by just this, how helpful that can be if you are working on something. Just want to know, make sure you're on the right track, see how it's going accessibility wise. Accessibility preview is your friend. So we've covered a lot of good things in our goodies section. Let's just go over them again. We have default basic accessibility, accessibility representation API, accessibility custom content, accessibility sort priority, and accessibility preview. So 5 very, very good things in Swiftui accessibility. On the flip side of goodies, we've got gotchas. So let's talk about those. Gotcha number 1, default basic accessibility. Probably thinking, wait, hang on, that was the first goodie. What's going on? Well, if you think back to the beginning, goodies can totally become gotchas really quickly, really easily. So with the default basic accessibility that Swiftui provides, it doesn't always make sense without additional information or context. There's certain elements that when you focus over them, without certain context or information, what Swiftui does by default, it might not make a lot of sense to a user. And this same thing goes for the order in which elements are focused with an assistive technology. Doesn't always result in a logical, easily navigable experience. Take, for example, our sort priority. When it was default, we didn't even get to our edit button. We didn't know that that was there. So, that's an example of a shortfall of default basic accessibility if you're not careful. Also, some elements make much more sense when they are grouped together or contained in a certain way. Also, this is very important. We touched on it a little bit earlier, but custom controls. Certain types of them don't always have the same default basic accessibility that others do. So one type of custom control, like say you make a custom button, that might be able to be activated with an assistive technology by default, but another one might not. If you take, for example, our slider, our custom slider, we couldn't even focus on the control part of that. And then finally, this is another point I can't overemphasize. Decent out of the box basic accessibility is not equal to great accessibility experience for users. It's very important. We want it to be great. Decent's not good enough. So we're back at our add plant screen, and we're going to take a look at what the default basic accessibility is like on this. You're going to notice there's a lot of repeated information. There's some views that should be announced, grouped together, and they're not, and it's a little bit hard to tell what goes with what. The custom toggle announcement does not make it clear that it's a button, that it can be activated, which we saw earlier. And then again, our friend, the custom slider, is not even going to be focused with voiceover, just the text labels. So let's go take a look at what this is like.
Add plant. Enter plant name. Text field. Double tap to edit. Plant health. Plant health. Unspecified. Button. Plant category. Plant category. Button. Image. Gift card. Logo other. Unspecified. Houseplant. Button. Add plant. Plant is repotted. Circle. Image. Window distance. In window. 0 inch. Pot size. Remove. Dimmed. Button. Add. Button.
So there was a lot to take in there. Like I said, a lot of repeated information. We could see that the order in which our custom stepper was announced made no sense at all. By default, it's going to go 1 inch pot size and then announce the buttons, without the label. They're remove, add. It's just really not clear. So this is how a goodie can become a gotcha like that really quickly, because it's not good enough for it to be decent. You just experienced what that was like, and it was not great. Gotcha number 2. Another accessibility sort priority. This is another goodie that can become a gotcha. You probably figured this one was coming, because I mentioned I got a lot of feelings about it. So this, as we mentioned earlier, changes the order which elements are focused. You've really got to use it with extreme caution, lots of thought and care. Some things to think about when you're deciding whether or not this is a right thing to use is which elements and in what order would a user want to navigate through them. Put yourself in their shoes. Put yourself in that mindset. Which order makes the most sense in terms of just overall the whole screen? And also what order provides all of the necessary context. If used incorrectly, you can make an app very, very confusing and or inefficient to navigate. So accessibility sort priority can become a problem pretty quickly. And this, very important, don't choose the sort priority based on where you want users to swipe to first or where you want them to swipe to next. Choose based on what would make the most semantic sense to the user. What's going to make the best experience? What makes sense to the user? That should be the main thing to think about. And we are continuing on accessibility sort priority. I told you I got a lot of feelings about it. Seriously, only ever use it if it's going to make the app easier, more logical to navigate. Never ever use this modifier to increase prominence or consumption rate of something that's revenue generating. Accessibility sort priority is here to make your app more navigable. It's not something that is here in order to manipulate the user experience, increase revenue, or eyeballs on something. When I first heard about accessibility sort priority, this was my first fear. I just had little nightmares dancing in my head of people using it this way. So an example of something you definitely wouldn't want to do, if you got a paid app scenario, say that you got an app that costs money and you have some sort of a pay or subscribe button in there. Don't even think about it. Don't even think about changing the sort priority to focus on the pay button first, if that doesn't make logical sense for navigation. Just, got a lot to say about that. So more on the accessibility sort priority is that it can be tricky because it can be something where it seems like it's a great solution, but there's actually something else that could be better. So an example of that would be if you've got a view that contains multiple instances of another view or another element that's frequently focused on with an assistive technology. If you take all of our plant tiles on the main grid screen, for example, in situations like that, you might want to consider using the contain behavior, the accessibility element contain behavior, to avoid a potentially repetitive and cumbersome navigation experience. So let's take a look at what that's like. So I was thinking initially when I made this, oh, we've got a living room heading. Each room in our Plantiverse has a heading, and it'll have the filter button on one side, the name of the room in the middle, and then on the other side, an add plant button. So in our Plantiverse, we'll have multiple rooms. So that means multiple headings and all of those elements. So I was thinking, oh, great. People are going to want to know first when they go to a section, which room am I in? Then they'll want to know the edit button, the add button. So that was what I thought. But then I tried it out with VoiceOver and it was clunky. So let me just take a beat and play that for you.
Line, 3 horizontal, decrease, button, heading, living room, add, button, aloe vera, good, succulent, button, monstera delicosa, repot, great, houseplant, button, snake plant, repot, good, succulent, button, pothos, clean, houseplant, button.
So say that I want to go from my living room to my dining room. I'm going to have to go through each element in that room heading, hear it. Then I'm going to go through each tile after that. And then I'm going to go to my dining room and go through those elements. So let's just hope that I wouldn't, want to get to a room that's all the way at the bottom, or I'd just be swiping forever. So that is a case where I thought, oh, great, sort priority. No, no. I learned pretty quickly that it's a much better experience in this case for use accessibility children contain. So let's hear what that's like.
Plantiverse. My Plantiverse. Living room, heading. Actions available.
So in this example, here we have the announcement of living room, heading, actions available. That's a lot better and a lot more meaningful than, line 3, decrease button, living room, add. It's just better having it all grouped into one element and allowing users to have the choice of hearing, oh, actions available. I can decide if I want to know what those actions are, if it's even relevant to me. So this is another way in which accessibility sort priority can kind of come back and bite you. Might seem like a good solution, but some situations, there's better things available that you can use. Oh, gotcha. Number 3, SF symbol images. This one, this one is super interesting to me because it's just such an easy thing to do without realizing. So in Swiftui, there's an option to create an image using a system name initializer, where you would pass in the name of an SF symbol and it'll make an image of that. It's great, very convenient. But when you do it this way, the system name is what's used by default as the accessibility label. So, if you look at this screenshot that I have, we have within our curly braces of our computed property of our view, we have an image with a system name parameter, and we put in the SF symbol name, gearshaped.fill. So that, in that case, will be our announcement. That'll be our accessibility label. That's not great. So a really good way to remedy this, and it's easy peasy, is just put an accessibility label on those. Whenever you, use the system name initializer for an image, put that accessibility label there. Don't forget it. If you take a look at the screenshot at the bottom, we've got, an image using the system name initializer, gearshape.fill, but then underneath that, we are adding an accessibility label. We're saying dot accessibility label, and then we're giving it our text we want it to say, which is edit plant. So with that one line, you can make a much different, much better experience. So just because I said we're going to see all these recorded, I just want everyone to imagine going to your plant screen, and then you just hear this.
Gear shade, fill, button.
No, not great. Not great. You add an accessibility label, you can avoid all that, and it would say edit plant button. And that's a lot better. So that's why you've got to really be careful with these SF symbol images. Gotcha number 4, text-based image overlays. In Swiftui, they have a really cool thing. You can add overlays onto elements. There's one scenario where you can add an overlay onto images. And if you do that and you make an overlay that's text, like a watermark would be kind of what that would be like. You've really got to be sure that the color contrast ratio is passing, because that can be huge issue. You might think, oh, well, what if I just, add an accessibility label and that'll say all the text in the overlay? That's good, right? No, that is not correct. That will not help out. It doesn't resolve the color contrast failure, and it's not going to be helpful for users who are sighted but low vision, who maybe don't use a screen reader. They're not going to be able to consume that information. They're going to miss that. So here's an example. What I'm talking about, we've got our plant detail screen, and on our plant picture, we've got a text overlay of the plant's name, Monstera delicosa. It's very, very hard to read what that says, especially over top of an image. The text is way too light for that background, and it's just not contrasting enough. So this is an example of what you should not do with an image overlay. Gotcha number 5. Po Buddy's nerfed. No matter how many goodies come out, no matter how much Swiftui is, growing and becoming stable, there's not going to be a replacement for the human element. Nothing is perfect. And that's why a human element is so important, but also because with accessibility, context is so, so crucial. So that's another reason why this human element is just irreplaceable. You should also never, ever operate on the assumption that everything is going to be working flawlessly and that things work as expected. Regardless of how mature and stable and robust a language is, things happen, mistakes happen. Sometimes things don't work the way they're supposed to. It's also worth noting that Swiftui and some of the accessibility APIs that we've covered today, they're still relatively young. So there's a bit more likelihood that there's going to be some bugs. In fact, I actually found a bug in the accessibility representation API that happens when you use it to represent an adjustable control, like the custom slider, for example. So let's take a look at this. This is an example of the bug that I found. A custom slider, ideally it should be announced as window distance in window, swipe up or down with one finger to adjust the value. And then we'd expect that the slider position and the value label would update with each swipe. And then similarly, on the custom stepper that we have, we would expect the announcement to be, we'd want the announcement to be pot size, 0-inch, adjustable, swipe up or down with one finger to adjust the value. And then, like the slider, that value label should update with each swipe. However, with this bug, that does not happen until you do the classic turn it off and turn it back on again. I had to turn voiceover off, turn it back on again in order to get the announcement to be correct. So let's see what that's like. Just imagine you're a user using this and experience this.
Add planned. Window distance. Window distance. Pot size. Voiceover off.
Okay, it's off.
Voiceover on. Plantiverse. Add planned. Window distance. Window distance. In window. Adjustable. Swipe up or down with one finger to adjust the value. 1 foot. 2 feet. 3 feet. Pot size. 0-inch. Adjustable. Swipe up or down with one finger to adjust the value. 1 inch. 2 inch. 3 inch.
All right. So we got there. We got the right behavior, but we had to turn it off and back on again. So this is just case in point why you can never replace that human element and why you've really got to experience your app and your app's accessibility firsthand. It is crucial. So you don't end up having things like this happen. So we've covered a lot in terms of the gotchas. So let's just go over them again. We've got default basic accessibility, accessibility sort priority, SF symbol images, text-based image overlays, and last but not least, Po Buddy's nerfed. Those are our gotchas. So how do we turn those gotchas into goodies? That's what we want to do, right? So one thing that can be very helpful, especially when you're in your development cycle, is really making use out of that accessibility preview. It can give you a good sense of what track you're on, where you're headed. So that's a big time saver. It's very convenient, very informative. Another way to fix issues from gotchas. Again, always experience your app with an assistive technology. Do every screen. See what it's like. You'll probably find things you didn't think of before. It can be really useful. If you'd like, if using a framework is more your thing, then we have actually just recently released XDevTools XCUI with Swiftui support. So that is very exciting, especially if you're writing your apps in Swiftui. And also, if you're using UIKit, we've also got Axe DevTools for iOS, which is just for UIKit. Deque can also help with manual assessments and audits, and we also offer accessibility consulting. And finally, if you want to mess around with the accessibility of Swiftui and get hands-on with it to learn about the gotchas and goodies, you can feel free to download this repo, this Plantiverse repo, and mess around with it, see what it's like. So let's just do some key takeaways because we've covered a lot of things today. So first, Swiftui does provide a somewhat decent accessibility experience out of the box. But again, somewhat decent is not good enough and will never be good enough when it comes to accessibility. It's got to be great. Default elements and controls are focusable with an assistive technology. They have a default accessibility label, and when applicable, actions are provided automatically for users to activate controls. It's important to remember with that in mind that not all custom controls are focusable by default. Then we talked about some goodies. Those were default basic accessibility, accessibility representation API, accessibility sort priority, accessibility custom content, one of my favorites, accessibility preview. And then we went on the flip side of those and looked at some gotchas, which were default basic accessibility, accessibility sort priority, SF symbol images, text-based image overlays, and PoBuddy's Nerfect. So I've included here, I've included all of some social links for Deque systems. If you want to get in contact, we've got Deque's LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter. I've put the link to the Plantiverse app repo here. Feel free to clone it. And I've also put my email here. If you have any questions or anything that you'd like to share about Swiftui and accessibility, anything that you've learned from your experience, I'd love to hear it. So with that, I will open up the floor for questions, and thank you all for attending.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for that, Kate. That was really, I love your little Plantiverse app. That's such a good idea for a demonstration. So I know there were a couple of questions submitted. I'm going to let folks take a look and vote on which ones they feel they might want to hear more about, or take an extra second to submit any questions you might have thought of. And then we'll throw some at you and kind of wrap up today's session after that. All right, so I'm going to start with the one at the top here. There is a question about the videos associated with your slides. This person says, I know the slides are available, but how about the videos associated with the slides? They're not embedded in the slides PDF.
Oh, well, sorry about that. Shoot me a message, an email, and I can actually send. I've got all the recordings all saved and ready to go on a folder on my machine. So I can absolutely share that with you. Just reach out and I'll get them to you.
All right. Next one we have is from Jacob. He says, or they say, as an iOS engineer, what do you think? What could Apple improve more in Swiftui or in Xcode to enhance the accessible UI even further?
Oh gosh. Wow. Well, as far as Xcode, there's always a handful of things that could be made a little bit better with Xcode. I think one thing that would be very helpful would be, just with Swiftui is a thing that gets just kind of a hang up in the development process. I'd say that would be one thing for sure. I can't think of, that's a great question. I can't think of anything else off the top of my head, but I'm sure that after I'm back developing a little bit more, I'll think of a few things.
Of course.
So, yeah. Again, feel free to, shoot me a message and I can send you some things I realize later.
All right. Well, yeah, so definitely reach out if you guys are if you are looking for resources or the slides, you can always find those on the session's webpage for today, as well as an on-demand recording of this session, which you can watch at any time. So with that, I think we're gonna wrap up and let our busy interpreters move along so they can keep interpreting for us. But keep on coming to the sessions, keep asking questions, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks, everyone.